Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
The shutdown reflects more than missed deadlines. It's the result of years of executive overreach, weakened oversight, and a funding process that's lost its guardrails. Here to explain how these shifts have eroded trust and what it will take to restore transparency and accountability is the Project on Government Oversight's director of the Effective and Accountable Government Program, Faith Williams. Faith, thank you so much for joining me.
So glad to be here.
We are in the midst of a government shutdown. You've looked backward to trace kind of how we got here and identified some unusual conditions. Let's walk through those. You've argued that the White House has been withholding key information from Congress. That's a key part of this. Tell us more.
Yeah, I would love to. The path toward the shutdown takes the same beats as the path toward the executive overreach into Congress's power of the purse. With each step the administration has made to wrest control of that appropriations, that spending power, we have gone that much further down the path toward a shutdown. So I'm happy to go back and kind of start at the beginning.
Well, let's start at the beginning. Yeah.
Right. It's certainly worth noting that the budget and appropriations process has not worked as intended for a long time. The so-called typical process where all 12 appropriations bills are passed in a timely manner ahead of the next fiscal year, which starts on October 1st of any given year. That hasn't happened for a while. So the process was weakened, and I think what we've seen in the last 9 months has completely broken it. So it began with the budget. So typically the president sends their budget to Congress in February. It's not unusual for a new administration to have a delay on that. And this is indeed a change from the Biden to the Trump administration. The president didn't even send what sort of insidery termed as a skinny budget until May, and then never actually sent a full budget. And in fact, OMB Director Russell Vought, and we'll come back to him at a few times in our tale, defended the decision to avoid providing a detailed budget, saying that doing so wasn't in the administration's interest. And I'm sure he was correct on that. It probably was not in the administration's interest. But why is this important? Congress takes the president's more detailed budget document as a starting point for its own appropriations negotiations. It's a way for the president to signal, here are my priorities, and for the same parties in Congress, and in this case, the Republican parties in charge of both House and Senate, to say, okay, time to execute based on the president's priorities. So that was the first indicator that this was going to be different.
And by not submitting a budget, it might not have been in the administration's interest, but it is law that they have to submit one, correct?
It is law. It is law. And they submitted a skinny one. So I think they might, and a skinny one simply means it just had less information, more top lines, less detail. I'm not a lawyer. I suppose that an argument could be made that that skinny budget met that legal requirement, but it certainly was out of step with past practice and norm, let's say.
And did members of Congress raise any concerns at that point?
They did not in particular, not in any kind of meaningful way. And in part, I think that points back to the process being dysfunctional in the first place. That the president's budget was a starting point, but not any kind of requirement for Congress to adhere to. I think, again, at a time when the same party controls the White House and both houses of Congress, it could have been more of a guiding document than it might be in other instances, but it is still simply just a starting point for Congress.
So what was the next step along this path?
The next step was the Office of Management and Budget, headed by, again, Director Russell Vought, taking down a government website that tracked how OMB actually allocated the funds that are appropriated by Congress, how OMB allocated those funds out to the agencies. This is super technical, and these are called apportionments, and people might be somewhat more familiar with that word from redistricting. It is the same word. It means something different in this context. It's essentially, once Congress says, administration, you have $100 to spend, OMB is in charge of actually getting that money in an organized fashion to government agencies. For a long time, how OMB did that was a secret, and POGO, along with many partner organizations, lobbied Congress to pass legislation making those decisions public, because it's a really important piece of the transparency puzzle. We were successful a few years ago. The website tracking this information went live. But then in March, OMB took it down. And this is directly contravening a law passed by Congress, as I just mentioned. There was a lawsuit. It took many months. But indeed, in, I want to say mid-August, OMB put that information back up online. That is good. What we learned when it put up that information is that it was also incomplete. This sounds very technical, so I will try to skip over the technicalities, but essentially, the information that got posted again referenced plans that the agency had to submit to OMB to get their funding released. It referenced plans, but it didn't actually share what those plans were. So we could see OMB pausing funding to agencies based on these plans, but we couldn't see the reason why. So even though that website went back online, we don't have all of the information that we need. So that was the next thing that happened, the apportionment website going dark.
I'm speaking with Faith Williams. She's the director of the Effective and Accountable Government Program at the Project on Government Oversight. All right, so tell us about Step 3.
Step 3 was an opaque rescissions package that was sent to the Hill over the summer. Again, so technical, but what a rescission is, it's a totally legal mechanism that is based on law passed by Congress, just about 50 years ago, that says the administration can make a formal request to Congress saying, I don't want to spend these funds. Can you approve that? President Trump is certainly not the first president to use the rescissions tool. What made it a little bit different this summer was the opacity of that rescissions package. And that did merit comment from members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, and I think in particular appropriators. So the package that the administration sent to Congress, that Congress then turns into a resolution to approve, essentially, was very light on the details. And we're seeing throwbacks here a little bit to the budget document. It had high-level information, but not detailed information. So essentially, the White House was telling Congress, you just need to trust us. We want to claw back this money. You just have to trust us that we're going to do it in the places where we tell you. And that's an interesting exercise of trust. So, for example, Senator Susan Collins voted against the rescissions package, against discharging it from the committee, stating, and I'm quoting her here, the rescissions package has a big problem. Nobody really knows what program reductions are in it. That seems pretty fundamental. And as you might know, Senator Collins is an appropriator, one of the lead appropriators. Other senators expressed concern. So it was a bit of a gamble. The administration saying, trust us. And at that moment, Congress said, sure.
So, Faith, we find ourselves now sitting in a shutdown with this history from the White House. They're not the first administration to try rescissions, as you said, or to slow roll a budget submission. But this seems kind of cumulative. What does it mean now for the negotiations that will have to happen to resolve this shutdown?
I think negotiations is the key word. And negotiations require trust and good faith that both sides will adhere to the deal that is struck. And what each of these incremental steps have done is erode, admittedly low-level trust, but erode what trust remained in the appropriations process. In order to strike a deal to get out of this shutdown, both parties in Congress, right, Democrats and Republicans, will need to come together with the White House, and they will need to trust the White House that the deal they pass will stick. And what we've seen so far is a real willingness from the White House to renege on those deals. Even the funding bill that was passed this past spring, there is evidence that has been reported by partners and in the media that even some of that funding isn't going where it's supposed to go. So how can a deal be struck now if the White House and the administration can just go back on any deal? And this, I think the real straw that broke the camel's back here was the so-called pocket rescissions attempt that happened at the end of August. Super technical, but all it really means is another effort from the administration to say, we in fact have power of the purse. You, Congress, do not. So if that is the case, how on earth can Congress make a deal?
So POGO has suggested oversight reforms and processes to get after some of the fundamental process issues that you've articulated here. What's the status on those?
So POGO has supported reforms in the past, continues to support reforms that would more clearly delineate Congress's power with regard to appropriations and bolster the only real backstop we have about the illegal withholding of funds, which is called impoundment. At the moment, and so far how the courts have ruled as well, it appears that the only remedy we have, I suppose, for impoundment, or the only means to litigate is through the Government Accountability Office. They're the only ones that can do it, GAO. So we have supported legislation like the Congressional Power of the Purse Act that would just kind of better articulate the process and bolster the power where it's supposed to be. But beyond that, there has to be an appetite and an attitude from members of Congress on both sides of the aisle that this is a problem. And I think we are starting to see that, and we are increasingly seeing that, but I don't believe that we are at critical mass yet. We need equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats saying this is our power and you cannot have it.
What do you think it will take to mobilize critical mass?
It's a great question. And I think a lot about that exact question in order to advance our reforms. I think one element is, I've said so many times throughout just our brief conversation how technical these issues are. I think it is really incumbent upon me, upon groups like POGO, upon our partners to do a better job of explaining why all of this matters. Because at the end of the day, we elect representatives in Congress who apportion money that they feel will benefit us as a nation, their states, their districts, our communities, etc. That is how it is supposed to work. And so we need to do a better job of connecting the harm that happens when that doesn't occur, when instead one person or even one administration makes those decisions instead of our elected officials. So I think some of that is just better explaining why this all matters. And I also think as the administration kind of keeps pushing the boundaries on power of the purse issues, we will see some increased pushback from Congress. But it can't just be a few appropriators in the Senate. It just has to be more than that.
I've been speaking with Faith Williams. She's the director of the Effective and Accountable Government Program at the Project on Government Oversight. Faith, thanks so much for walking us through this explainer.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.